Hello, and thank you for your interest in viewing the NWA Stormwater discussion recording. This is a recording of the discussion that was held on June 30th, 2021 at the Illinois River Watershed Partnership Learning Center in Cave Springs, Arkansas. I'm going to start off by giving just a brief introduction, and then the recording will begin with Dr. Nicole Hardiman. So let's get started. Here is a map of the Illinois River watershed. And as you can see up in the top corner is a more urbanized Northwest Arkansas area, and the river flows down into Lake Tenkiller in Oklahoma. IRWP's vision is that the Illinois River and its tributaries will be a fully functioning ecosystem where ecological protection, conservation, and economically productive uses support diverse aquatic and riparian communities, meet all state and federal water quality standards, and promote economic sustainability as well as provide recreational opportunities. Our mission is to improve the integrity of the Illinois River watershed through public education, outreach, and the implementation of conservation and restoration practices throughout the watershed. So we're here to connect you guys with the resources you need and to foster discussion that will protect the watershed from water quantity and water quality issues. So today's goals are to educate people about urban stormwater and foster this discussion. And our ask at the end of this is that you pledge to uphold the Northwest Arkansas Stormwater Action Plan. IRWP's role here is just to facilitate the listening and learning, and we know that everyone here is doing the best that they can. We want to foster this discussion, of course, but let's stay on topic. And ultimately, we understand that each city or municipality is going to have a different combination of solutions that's right for the community and the constituents. So now I will pass it off to Nicole Hardiman, who will give you a status update on stream bank erosion in the Illinois River watershed.
Amount of erosion we started with. The amount of erosion we started with, how much the bank had eroded in year one or after a year, and how much the bank had eroded in year two. So these are just some of the results. So 2% of the stream banks rated as extreme, so losing at least 3 feet a year. The takeaway here is that 38% of the stream banks were losing at least 1 foot per year, and this is across the entire watershed. What this indicates to us is like system-wide change. Something is happening to this watershed to facilitate, cause this extreme erosion that we're seeing. So we had an average erosion rate of 5.2 feet per year. We had one landowner that was losing an average of 42 feet per year. Sediment loading of the study, this is just the study area. So this was like 5% of the stream banks in the watershed. So just that study area was loading 37,000 tons of sediment per year. Phosphorus loading was 56,000 pounds per year. And we worked with to put that number in perspective, worked with our 5 largest wastewater treatment facilities to just have a number to compare to. And they are putting in 24,000 pounds per year. So stream bank erosion alone is loading over twice the amount of our wastewater treatment facilities. The takeaway for me that I say, which could be debated probably, is like, if we turned off all the phosphorus in the wastewater treatment facilities, if that was even technically or financially feasible, we still would have a phosphorus problem just from stream bank erosion. Why do we care? Who cares about stream bank erosion? So it's a loss of productive lands. If we assume that land right now in Arkansas in the watershed's going for what, 5,000, 6,000 an acre, that's, money directly we're sending to Lake Tenkiller. It's a safety hazard for people and livestock. It threatens infrastructure. So many of you are dealing with this every day trying to deal with flooding and then the infrastructure losses that we have. And then, as I said, sediment and nutrient loading, it's expensive to treat. We do have, so, the Illinois River is a drinking water source. We estimate for about 65,000 customers. It's really hard to treat for, impacts aquatic wildlife, and will have potential and continued impairment, especially in Oklahoma. So what's the role of urban stormwater here? Okay, so we're going to do a little bit of math, some back of the napkin math here. So in a natural ground cover scenario, you'll have about, so if 1 inch of rain falls on 1 acre of land, about 40% of that 1 inch of rain will evaporate. 50% will infiltrate down into the soil, and 10% will run across the land. If we go to a medium density, which is approximately what Northwest Arkansas is, you can see here, evaporation doesn't really change in a 1 inch rain, but infiltration goes down significantly and runoff increases. So 1 inch rain over 1 acre is 27,000 gallons. So in natural ground cover scenario, 10,000 gallons would evaporate, 2,700 gallons would run over the land, and 13,000 gallons would infiltrate down. In a medium density scenario, again, evaporation doesn't change much. 9,000 evaporates, 8,000 runs over the land, and 9,500 infiltrate down into the soil. So the key takeaway is that for each 1 inch rain, we have 5,400 more gallons of water flowing over the land and, going into detention and retention in some cases, but ultimately getting to our local creek, river, or stream. So I took this neighborhood as an example. If you recognize this neighborhood, I only chose it because this is where I grew up. This is my neighborhood. My parents' house is like right there. So if each 1 acre of land produces 5,400 more gallons of water, then the 66 acre neighborhood is producing 358,000 more gallons of water in a 1 inch rain. So here's the neighborhood I grew up in. Here's the little tributaries, the headwaters, and here's where that water all flows to. So this upstream watershed area is 2,600 acres, which results in 14 million more gallons of water. This is a very small snippet of Northwest Arkansas. So the approximate area, and again, this is all estimation, my own back of the napkin calculations. In Northwest Arkansas, we are producing 263 million gallons of rain, or gallons of water, with each 1 inch rain. So that's just kind of the land use change bit. We have a couple of different complications, and that we all know we have changing rates of precipitation. We just had that terrible rain in what was that, the end of April or whatever? These are some images from that. So we're having this changing precipitation pattern. Complication 3. So we do, have stormwater infrastructure that's intended to sort of deal with this situation, but we do have some areas where there are aging and malfunctioning stormwater infrastructure. And this is across Northwest Arkansas. It's not just one city. Complication 4, we have many small towns that are growing at crazy fast rates. So these are each of the small towns. You won't see the big 4 in here. But so out of the list of 5, there were on this list 500 towns in Northwest Arkansas. Not one of them is stable population or decreasing population. Okay, I'm going to try technology again. So how do urban stormwater how does that relate to stream bank erosion? And I just want to show you this little demonstration video. So you can see here, there's this, oh, dang it. I'm not much on technology, I'll admit that. There we are. So COVID's been kind of tough for me. Okay, so in a typical stream, you see here, not much is changing. There's a constant rate of sediment flowing through the system. This is kind of how a natural system works. But if you channelize or change the flow of the water, so channelize, I mean just make it straight, you can see here that the water starts flowing at a much faster rate and just starts kind of eating away at this section of river. You'll get areas that flow faster than some areas that flow slower. So you get some deposition, what we call, in the slow moving areas, and then more erosion as the water speeds up here. Okay, so now we've put more water into the system at second 53. And you can just see while this up headwater section where many of our cities are hasn't changed very much, you see what's happening over here. And if we get the field tour, Crawfords, this is exactly what's happening on your property right here. The stream is widening, it's getting more shallow. You have extreme erosion on both sides. And so the whole kind of, as we would put it in IRWP terms, the ecological function of this river is completely decimated whenever you get this extreme volume of water. Okay, stop share, reshare. Come on, there we go. Fortunately, there are solutions for all of these complicating factors. So if you look at this river here, the Illinois River, imagine this bit is like a detention pond, and imagine this over here is all a neighborhood. So we can increase opportunities for infiltration in the neighborhoods before they get to their detention area. So we're talking like rain gardens, porous pavers, bioswales, all those sorts of practices. Then when the water gets to the detention area, we can clean it and slow it down before it moves on to the creek. And then for the actual river itself, we need to allow space for the creeks and streams to expand and contract. So building in the floodplain basically constricts that flow and makes the water move faster through the system. Okay, this is from my board member, Mr. James Simpson. I want to thank you so much for being here and endeavoring on this conversation. We will recircle back after our presentations with a specific ask for y'all, and I hope that you will be convinced to participate. Oh, and I did want to say, if this meeting goes to hell in a handbasket, don't blame Leaf. This is all my doing. Okay, and with that, I'm going to hand it over. So we'll have a great series of discussions today. Rhiannon Hart with Corps of Engineers, who's going to kind of present some of the scientific findings around this.
Thank you. Okay, I think I'm going to go stand over on this side. I really hate talking into microphones, so when she said I had to, I was pretty bummed out because I'm really good at yelling too. Well, good morning, everybody. I am Rhiannon Hart, and I work with the Army Corps of Engineers. I am currently working on a Illinois River flood study with our partners, GRDA and the Cherokee Nation. So I'm going to present some of the study. It's not completed, so this is kind of the first part of the study, and so I'm going to give you some of the data that we've come up with so far. So the objective of our study is to identify the major contributing factors to the increased stream flows in the Illinois River in Northwest Arkansas and Northeast Oklahoma. And by doing this, we're going to look at land use trends, precipitation trends, stream flow trends, and then we're also doing some modeling. So we built an HMS watershed model and a RAS river model. And we're doing this in order to quantify and identify the significant sources of the runoff in order to produce some scenarios to maybe see what we can do to decrease the frequency and magnitude of flooding. So the scenarios haven't been developed yet. Those are still in discussions. But something like, adding riparian buffers, retention ponds, as Nicole just mentioned. So the outline, I'm going to go over some of the land use trends and then talk about the precipitation trends for the entire basin, some stream flow trends, and talk about some stream flow characteristics. And then I'm just going to show some of the modeling results. Maybe. It's not advancing. Can you advance it for me, please? Thanks. There we go. Oh. Okay, so here are the land use change maps starting in 1992, going through 2001, and then through 2016. The red areas are the developed land, and I just, we all know that the part of the basin that's been developed the most is in the northeast portion of the watershed. There's a pretty significant change, as you can see, from 2001 to 2016. Some of the smaller areas, like this is Tahlequah in Oklahoma, it has had some change, but not near as much as the northeast part of the basin. Oh, did I do that? Maybe I should just let you do it. Okay, so here is a graphical representation from the maps that I just showed. Area in square miles, and then we got the developed or the different land use classifications on the y-axis. And then here is the developed land. So you can see from 1992, 2001, 2016, the increase. In 1992, there was about 62.2 square miles of developed land. And keep in mind, this is the entire watershed because I'm looking at it from, big picture. 2001, there was 142.6 square miles, which was about 130% increase in developed land. And then from 2001 to 2016, there was another 20% increase. I'm sure if we were to be able to have the 2020 land use, there would probably be another significant increase in the amount of developed land. Some other things to note is forest land increased and hay and pasture land actually decreased. So I guess some of that hay pasture land was converted to forest, which is actually good for the watershed. If we could go back to this map for just a second. It looks like the majority of it is kind of in this part on the Oklahoma side, just by visual look-sees. So just wanted to make that clear. So then next I wanted to look at the population trends just to kind of figure out, when about the developmental boom actually happened. So I plotted the population data for Benton and Washington County going back to 1970. And you can see there's a pretty sharp inflection point about 1990 where the population just really started increasing substantially, especially for Benton County. Go ahead. So as I mentioned, we are building the watershed model and the river model for the entire basin. The left-hand map shows all of the stream gauges, the U.S. Geological Stream Gauging stations within the watershed. For this talk, I'm just going to focus on these three. So we got Illinois River at Tahlequah, Illinois River at Watts, and then Osage Creek at near Elm Springs. So here's the data for those 3 sites. All of them have really long periods of record. They go back to 1935 for Tahlequah and 1950 for Osage Creek. There is a gap of data in Osage Creek, but it didn't really affect. It was enough data to run the statistics and the trends. This is going to be bad without having my animations, but I think if you started it from here, we can. Okay, so what we did is we took the climate data from the PRISM Climate Group. They're out of Oregon State University. They have climate data going back to 1895, so it's a really long-standing set of climate data. We took that data and averaged the data, the precipitation data above each site, so in the subbasin above each gauge, and that's our average. So this 0 line represents the long-term average precipitation for each site. The bar graphs are the departure from that precipitation. So anything below 0 is less precipitation than the long-term average, and everything above 0 is the additional precipitation above the long-term average. The blue line just kind of represents the moving average of all those bars within them. The gray lines are error around that blue line. But point is you can kind of watch it go up and down and over, and then it starts to take a pretty sharp turn upwards for the later part of the last decade. This is the fall precipitation. So we did it for fall. We did it for winter or spring. Sorry, this is spring. Same thing. And then winter. And then took the annual precipitation over all of them. And so you can see kind of hovers around and then whoop, way up high on the last part of the decade or so, with most of that coming from the spring precip. So we did this for all 3 sites, Osage at Elm. Here's Watts, spring precip, winter, and then the overall average annual. And then again for Tahlequah. And so you're seeing the same pattern among all of them, with the spring rains having the biggest contribution, and then with winter and fall also having a contribution to the annual. One thing I wanted to note was for this, we also did this for the summer months. And for summer, it just kind of hovered around that 0 line. So there wasn't any additional contribution of precip during the summer, but it stayed kind of the same going throughout. Okay, for stream flow, we looked at the average annual flow for each of the 3 sites. So this is Osage Creek. Here's that gap in data I was talking about from 1975 to 1925. Here's the slope of all that data. So there's definitely an increasing trend of the stream flow. Same for Watts. You can see that slope, Tahlequah. And then we wanted to look at the peak flows. So these are the highest flows for each year since data has been collected for each of the sites. One thing to note, it's an increasing trend, but look at these guys on the end, how much more peak flows there are than compared to the previous peak flows. You can see it in Watts, same thing. Large peak flows towards the end of the record versus towards the beginning. Tahlequah, it's a slight slope, but there was a pretty big event in 1950, and I think that might be pushing this line down quite a bit, but still, point is increasing trends in the peak flows. Okay, so I'm going to talk about some stream flow characteristics. So hydrologists use these to kind of help define what the stream is doing, the flow in the stream is doing. And we use magnitude, frequency, duration, timing, and rate of change of the stream. And a lot of times we do comparisons of before a period and after a period. A lot of ecosystem restoration work uses this type of stuff to figure out, what was the stream like before versus what it is now, and try to go back to what it was before. So I thought I'd employ this for this. And so I'm going to use that same 1990 click it, point as the before and after. And so here are the stream flow characteristics for magnitude. So we've got mean daily flows. We got stream flow on the y-axis, so in cubic feet per second. The blue in all these graphs is the prior to 1990 stream flows, and the green is the post 1990 stream flows. So for like example, mean daily flows, you can see that the average daily flow for all three sites is pretty significantly different post 1990 versus prior to 1990. Same for the median daily flows. There's definitely an increase post 1990 to prior to 1990. The bottom graph shows runoff. So this is annual runoff and cubic feet per second per square mile for each of the sites. Prior to 1990, before the big developmental boom, stream flow or runoff was about, 0.9 cubic feet per second per square mile. Post 1990, Osage Creek jumped up pretty large compared to the other two, 1.4 cubic feet per square mile versus, 1.2 for the Illinois sites, Illinois River sites. And so for frequency, I wanted to look at, how many low flow spells are occurring versus how many floods are occurring. So again, this axis represents the average number of events per year for both graphs. And prior to 1990, there were approximately about 2 low flow periods on average per year. And then post 1990, none. So for floods, prior to 1990, you were getting about 6 at Osage Creek, Elm Springs, and Watts, about 4 per average per year for Tahlequah. And then look at post 1990. The number of floods that are occurring at Osage Creek near Elm Springs has nearly doubled, or it has doubled. The floods have increased also at the other 2 sites, but not as much as Osage Creek near Elm. And then finally, I got one more after this, but duration. So this is stream flow again in cubic feet per second. I wanted to look at the minimum 1-day average versus the maximum 1-day average. So this is the minimum flow, 1-day average flow versus the maximum for the period of record prior to 1990 versus post 1990. And again, you can just see stream flow is increasing for both the low flows and the maximum flows. And then finally, this is my last stream flow characteristic slide. So this represents the change in flow days. So this is cubic feet per second per day. And so this is the rising limb of the hydrograph, and this is the falling limb of the hydrograph. And so for the rise rate, you can see that there is more water per day on the hydrograph than there was, so post 1990 versus what there was prior to 1990. And there's also more water on the falling hydrograph, now versus what there was prior to 1990. So not only are there more floods, there's more volume in these floods as well. So then I thought, okay, well, let's look at precipitation and break it up between those 2 time periods. So I used Osage Creek at Elm Springs just because it had the largest increase in floods. So this is the same data that I used before, going back to 1895. And this is the actual total precip per year. And then again, the trend line for that precip. And then this is post 1990. I don't know if you guys can see this, but the slope is 10 times greater than it was prior to 1990. So that precip is, not only is it increasing overall, it's increasing 10 times more in the last 30 years or so. So this represents the 1% annual exceedant probability. So this equals the 100-year flood. So the black dots are the peak flows that I showed earlier. The red dots are the 100-year flood. And this just represents, the area around that. And as we get more data, as we get more peak flows, we're able to hone in more on what the 100-year flood should be. I just wanted to point out that here at Watts, the 100-year flood, oh, it's a touch. Oh, you have. the 100-year flood has been exceeded 3 times in the last decade, where it hasn't been exceeded in, the past. Tahlequah, same thing, 2 times in the last decade or so. And then there's that 1950 flood. So one other time in the past. So for modeling results, and I'm not going to go too deep into this just because I don't want to bore you guys too much. I've already given you a bunch of numbers and graphs. But we looked at, when I decided on which events to model, so, we're looking specifically at the flooding events. I plotted the largest events that had occurred in the basin. And of the top 8, 6 were in the last decade. It's crazy. But May 1990 was another big one. And I wanted one that, kind of represented that pre-boom time period. And then these other 3, of course, were some of the largest. And then I have some other ones that for validation, but we don't need to talk about those. So here are the results. It's kind of a cryptic name at the top. So this is Illinois at Tahlequah, Illinois at Watts. This is stream flow on the y-axis. Blue is the simulated, so that's what the model is outputting, and black is the observed. So that's what we're actually seeing at the stream flow gauge. And pretty good fit for the May 1990 event. There's only 2 stream gauges there, so that's all I could really show. And then here we got the April 2011 event. We got Illinois at Watts, Illinois at Tahlequah, and then the Barren Fork at Dutch Mill. Again, I'm modeling the entire watershed. So all pretty good fits, as you can see. Blue simulated, black observed. December 2015 event. We got Flint Creek near West Sound Springs, Illinois Tahlequah, Barren Fork, Dutch Mill. Next. February 2018 event. That's Osage Elm Springs, Illinois Watts, and then Flint Creek, West Sound Springs. And I probably went through that pretty fast, but it's typically how I roll. So in conclusion, we all know population has increased, which has led to the developmental increase in the watershed, but precipitation has also increased, and overall, and more so in the last few decades. The stream flow characteristics indicate that the number of low flow days are decreasing, and low flow volumes are increasing. However, also the number of floods are increasing and are reaching higher volumes. There's just a lot more water in the system. The 100-year flood has occurred multiple times in the last decade, which we hadn't seen before, especially at Watts. Only one other time in Tahlequah. And then finally, looking at those plots of the simulated and observed stream flows that I just showed, we feel like the modeling results are good enough to develop those robust scenarios. So those are our next steps. We're going to come up with those scenarios, see if we can't reduce some of the flooding in the Illinois River, and stay tuned for a future presentation. So I think that's what I got. There's my email if anybody has any questions. I think we're going to look at, of course, money's going to limit what actually, but we're willing to throw anything in the model. I mean, that's cheap and fairly easy to do. So. Not yet. So that's something that possibly be happening. We're throwing that out there. The model is built, and once that model is built and calibrated, and we feel like it's a really good model, we can start focusing in on these smaller areas and use the larger model to inform the smaller models and start looking at city level situations. I don't know that answer. I mean, if there's, I would love to have that data. If we're talking about going down to a smaller scale, I would need that data, would love to have that data in order to develop, make sure the model is functioning like as it should. So. Anything else?
Thank you, Rhiannon. I appreciate all your work. All right, how we feeling? Does anyone think this is a bunch of bunk or feeling like there's something unaccounted for? Feedback is a blessing, so please no judgment here at the IRWP Learning Center. Okay. And again, feel free, get up, walk around, get some coffee. Oh, okay. Here we go. Right. Unless I go out the back door. Okay. I'll give you guys a 10-minute break if you promise to be back in your seats in 10 minutes. You guys want a break? Okay, I'll give you 10 minutes and Chris and I'll get situated. Yeah. Chris, can you hear me?
Hi, good morning, Nicole.
Okay, I'll let you share your screen.
All righty. Is there, yeah, let's start there. All right, can you see that?
We can see it, yes.
Okay, perfect.
Thank you so much. So we'll get started right at 9:30.
Okay, that sounds great.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Dan's rounding up the cattle. What a joyous group. We're just so happy to be together, aren't we? I'm happy you're here. Okay, so our next presenter is over in Denver. Is that correct, Chris?
I am actually in Fort Collins, about an hour north of Denver.
Collins. Beautiful Fort Collins, Colorado. Yep. He's with Right Water Engineers. Right Water's done a lot of work in Northwest Arkansas. They're doing work in Arkansas right now. And he is going to talk to us specifically about stormwater management and infrastructure, title being Evolution and Trends in Urban Stormwater Management. Chris, I will let you take it away. Thank you for being here.
All right, thank you, Nicole. Yeah, everyone can hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. Well, thank you again for inviting me to present to you today. A lot to get through in 30 minutes or so, but certainly it sounds like we'll have time for questions and answers a little bit later on in the program. So again, I'd like to, just kind of briefly go over a few things, evolutions and trends in urban stormwater management. This is, let's see here. Try to advance my screen. There we go. Okay. You know, some of what I'm going to present to you today is, you know, based on the work that we do here on the Front Range of Colorado. Some of it also is stems from some of the work that I did previous to joining Wright Water Engineers when I worked at the Colorado Stormwater Center at Colorado State University here in Fort Collins. And so briefly, I'll just give you guys a quick intro to Wright Water Engineers, in case you are not familiar with us at all. And then we'll talk about some, you know, common urban stormwater problems, many of which we have already touched on in some of the earlier presentations. And we'll talk about stormwater detention design criteria for flood control, stream stability, stream erosion, and then also biotic health. And then briefly, we'll talk about stormwater quality management as well. So again, just a brief intro to Wright Water Engineers. I've been with Wright Water for about 2.5 years. I've had many colleagues work on previous projects in the Northwest Arkansas region. Those folks include John Jones, Jane Clary, Andrew Earls, Ken Wright, who founded our company. And, you know, just some of the work that we have done in the past has been, you know, updating and developing stormwater criteria manuals, working on the Cave Springs recharge area protection plan, various stormwater master plans, stormwater permitting, phosphorus removal from wastewater and stormwater, and detention pond retrofit analysis. Wright Water has been working on stormwater criteria manuals for over 50 years, starting with the original Denver Urban Drainage Stormwater Criteria Manual, which was developed in 1969 by Ken Wright and some others. And really that manual has served as a benchmark to many other storm criteria manuals developed across the nation. We continue to work on projects. We have probably about 3 or 4 criteria manuals that we're currently updating here in Colorado, and we tend to provide peer review on criteria manuals that are developed outside of Colorado. I recently finished working on some projects in Lincoln, Nebraska, for example. I know Jane is working with Johnson County, who's going to be talking after me on some work there in Kansas. And we also provide a lot of expert testimony work. And so, you know, jumping right along, I'd like to show these aerial photographs of an area, Parker, Colorado, which is just outside of Denver, and really how that's evolved in the last 80 or 90 years. And so, you know, what you can see here are 1937, what the stream channels looked like. Obviously, very little urbanization or development at all. And specifically, you can see, you know, areas of aggradation of these stream channels. And over time, obviously, as we develop, we begin to encroach on these channels. And as Nicole showed in that great video earlier, as we encroach on these channels, we change the size, we change the dimensions, we change the direction, and that ultimately, you know, has significant consequences to flooding, stream stability, etc. And so I'm highlighting here, going from 1937 to 2013, you can see how much development has occurred along this this drainage way, and really you can barely even see a stream any longer in some of these areas. And this, of course, is one of our favorite graphics as stormwater managers, and Nicole already walked us through it, so I'm not going to repeat. Again, the story being that as we develop, as we increase impervious surfaces, we also increase runoff and decrease infiltration. This is just another graphic showing how development changes the response of a watershed. In this case, for a simple 10-year storm event in Fort Collins, developing the watershed results in about 4 times as high of peak runoff as pre-development. So going from 5 CFS up to 20 CFS. And that's only for a 10-year storm. Of course, as I think we're all familiar, that results in increased flooding. And it also results in channel instability and erosion. The chart that I'm showing here is from, this is a well-known study from the Pacific Northwest, but essentially what they found was that once you develop a watershed to increase the impervious area to only 10%, which again, sort of a typical residential watershed is going to be about 40 to 50% impervious, but it only takes adding 10% of impervious area before the channels begin to become unstable. Another way to, again, look at this problem is how this is a flow frequency curve for an undeveloped watershed, and then for a developed watershed when it is uncontrolled. And uncontrolled, I mean without putting proper stormwater detention and other management facilities in. And what this demonstrates is that the 100-year storm that occurred in undeveloped conditions will now, or the 100-year runoff from undeveloped conditions is now typically going to occur once every 10 years as the watershed develops. And the same thing with a 10-year, what was previously a 10-year runoff event now happens about every 4 years. And what was previously a 2-year runoff event now happens about 7 times per year. Same thing with a 1-year storm, previously happened approximately 1 time per year, or runoff event now can happen more than 10 times per year. And what's really critical, especially for these 1- and 2-year storms, is that these are the flows that generally that streams generally form around, usually the 1 to the 2-year runoff event. And so now, if we have an increased runoff to 7 to 10 times per year, that's obviously going to change the way that the channel responds. And so, what we typically do to address this increased runoff is provide detention. And what I want to do is first just kind of talk about the differences between what we call on-site detention versus regional detention. And on-site detention is usually what's going to occur for a smaller development, less than 40 acres or so of contributing area to these detention facilities. For a larger development, there might be multiple detention facilities on that development. These are generally privately owned and generally not considered in stormwater master plans. And I'll talk about why in a minute, but they're also located upstream of the major and minor drainage ways, and really they're designed to control flooding on a localized level. Now, some of the issues with on-site detention is, number one, a lack of maintenance. Because they're privately owned, they very often are not maintained, and so they don't ever end up operating the way that they were initially designed. This is a big issue. That is the reason why, for example, here in Colorado, we do not incorporate or include on-site detention into regional master plans. We just assume that over time, these facilities are not going to be maintained and they're not going to operate as well. The other issue that we found is that, and this is going back to the early 1970s with some great work done by Dr. McEwen, is that if these on-site detention basins are put in without any sort of plan in place, if they're just randomly placed throughout the watershed, what can ultimately happen is you can increase the flooding downstream. And the reason why that occurs is because the timing of the runoff being discharged from these facilities start to stack the peak flows up, and actually can increase flooding compared to there not being any on-site detention in the first place. And I'll talk about a few ways that we address that. So now I'll compare on-site detention to what we call regional detention. Again, in Colorado and other places, this is typically going to have a much larger contributing area, at least 100 acres, sometimes several hundred acres. And importantly, these are publicly owned and maintained. So the issues with them not functioning as they were designed to, it is really not an issue, because there's a public agency or entity that's responsible for keeping these things maintained. We do incorporate regional detention into master plans, and these are generally located along the major drainage ways. This schematic that I have here, this is an EPA swim model. So it's a hydraulic model for First Creek in the Denver area. And what I have circled here are two detention basins that I recently worked on designing and modeling. And the idea here is that First Creek, which I'm showing here, is a master planned channel and stream. And so somebody has come along over the course of the years, and they've identified areas along the stream where certain flows cannot be exceeded. And so even though that we were working, the detention basins that we were working on were located in the city of Aurora, for example, the city and county of Denver is immediately downstream, less than a mile from our project site. And we needed to coordinate with city and county of Denver on our design so that the flows that we were discharging from these regional basins were not going to significantly impact the folks downstream in city and county in Denver. So that's really the importance and the power of regional planning and sizing regional detention facilities. In terms of how we size these facilities, every organization does it a little bit different. And there's generally two important sort of criteria that need to be followed. Number one is designing to control certain return periods. So that might be the 2-year event, the 10-year event, the 100-year event, or others in between. The other thing that's set forth in the criteria are what the maximum allowable release rates are. And generally, as you can see, this is just a table of a summary of a couple of different organizations, but generally the maximum allowable release rates are equal to the pre-development peak flows. So we need to control the water so that the rate at which it's discharged from a pond is no greater than what occurred from that site prior to development. In some cases, and part of this goes to addressing the issue that I talked about, where you have multiple on-site detention facilities that may actually increase flooding or stack up the peaks, as we call it. Some places, such as here in Fort Collins, where I live, we actually have to over control. And what we mean there is, for example, we have to control the 100-year post-development peak flow down to the pre-development 2-year. So it's not just matching the 100-year pre-development, it's actually over controlling for that. And then, lastly, what I want to, for the Mile High Flood District, which is the regional flood control district in the Denver area, we use what's called full spectrum detention, along with controlling the 100-year flow. And the 100-year flow cannot exceed 90% of the pre-development. So that's actually a little bit of over control. And then the full spectrum detention is what I'll talk about here. Basically, what this is it's not directly related to a 2-year event or a 5-year event or a 10-year event, but it's basically a methodology to control all of the events. And so starting from, essentially a water quality event, which is, less than 1 year return interval, all the way up to the 100-year. And so what this graph is just showing is, full spectrum detention. The green line here is the flow frequency curve for an undeveloped watershed with about 2% impervious or less. And with full spectrum detention, that's shown in the gray line, we can actually pretty well meet and match that pre-development flow frequency curve. And compared to, for example, the blue curve, which is for a developed watershed without any detention, and then some modifications in between of, for example, controlling for just the 10-year and the 100-year events, or the water quality event plus the 10-year and the 100-year event. What is important to know is that this full spectrum detention methodology actually does not require all that much more additional storage volume than just capturing and treating the 10-year and the 100-year events. So you're not using more space, it doesn't cost more to develop, and it actually outperforms some of these other criteria that are out there. So kind of transferring into the stream erosion, which again, we saw some great photos and examples of earlier. Another way to look at these flow frequency curves is to plot the shear stress of a stream on these curves. And so what we have here, this is 0.8 pounds per square foot, and here's 0.26 pounds per square foot. These essentially relate to how much depth of water in a stream is needed to start eroding certain materials. So the 0.8 PSF might be a larger sort of sand material, and the 0.26 PSF might be more of like a clay or a silty material. The point being, and this was developed for a case study in Lenexa, Kansas, sorry. Again, the point being that as you change the hydrology, the frequency that these shear stresses are increased, or the shear stresses are increased corresponding to the development. And of course, that is going to cause erosion and stream instability. But what we can then do is look at the different controls that we provide in this detention pond and sort of tweak those and determine how, for a specific region, those controls need to be designed in order to reduce the erosion and the shear stresses in the streams. This is again from the same case study. The point that I want to show here is for these different shear stresses in an undeveloped condition. This is the number of hours, and this is over a 50-year simulation. But this is the number of hours that these shear stresses were exceeded. So that's basically telling you how many hours in, say, 50 years that stream is going to erode. And you can see for a developed watershed that's uncontrolled, that goes up significantly by an order of magnitude, almost 2,000% or 1,000%. But then if we put in certain stormwater controls, we can bring that down, not necessarily back to the undeveloped conditions, but we can certainly reduce how much that channel is working. Another point I'd like to make is that we can also look at these controls and begin to link them to the health of a stream. And by that, I mean, I'll just use the term, the bugs that are in the stream. You know, and this comes out of some work, again, from the Pacific Northwest originally, although we have applied it at other places in the country. But basically, we have this metric that we can measure and we can model in a stream called the T0.5. And we found that that correlates well to essentially the number of bugs that are in the stream or the stream health. And so as you get an increase in the T0.5, you generally see more bugs, a better stream health. And so we can begin to calculate this metric for certain stormwater design criteria and extrapolate how that's going to affect the bugs in the stream health. And finally, we used all of these concepts as part of a stream and watershed prioritization study here in Fort Collins. And the idea here was, you know, Fort Collins, we have about a dozen or 15 streams that sort of run through the city, and we wanted to figure out how to prioritize improving and going and putting in stream rehabilitation projects. But what we said first is, look, if you don't have the right controls in the watershed, you don't have enough detention in the watershed before you go and start to replace a stream, then that stream is going to continue to get blown out and continue to be maintained. And so we use some of those concepts, including the T0.5, some bug studies and whatnot, to basically say, okay, these watersheds, you need to put more stormwater controls in first before you go and fix the stream. These watersheds, you have enough stormwater controls in there right now where you can go ahead and fix the stream and you'll be fine. So in my last few minutes here, I do want to just touch briefly on stormwater quality. Obviously, channel erosion, flooding, those are significant issues. They cost a lot of money. They have, you know, cause a lot of damage, but obviously pollutants are just as important. And urban stormwater is you know, an issue for stream quality also. And so real quick, you know, there's you know, most cities that are over, I think the thresholds is 10,000 people right now, fall under an MS4 permit, which is Municipal Separate Storm Sewer Permit. And essentially what this permit requires, this is issued by the EPA or by the local environmental agency. And this permit has, you know, multiple regulations and requirements, including, you know, 6 programmatic controls: public education, illicit discharge detection, construction site runoff, and then post-construction site runoff controls for water quality. And the key language in these permits is that you have to implement these control measures to reduce the discharge of pollutants to the maximum extent practicable. And so the question becomes, what is MEP? What is maximum extent practicable? How does that affect the size of these control measures? How does it affect how they perform? We can't go and necessarily say that, oh, we're removing X amount of pollutants, and so that therefore it meets MEP requirements. It's a very vague standard. And so this is always a funny little slide is, you know, is this MEP? Is it okay just to leave the roadkill there, or is it better to heave it to the side of the road? Which of those is MEP? I don't know. But this, so going back to this concept, part of what we have done is looked at, okay, maximum extent practicable doesn't mean we have to remove everything. It means that we need to remove as much as we can that is cost effective and not overly burdensome to whoever has to pay for these facilities. And so, Dr. Pitt out of the University of Alabama, started doing some work years ago where he looked at how much, what percent of the total pollution that gets discharged from an urban site comes in certain rainfall events. And so this is an analysis that was done for Milwaukee, Wisconsin. But basically, you can look at these curves and say, okay, about 70% of the total runoff that occurs for rainfall events less than 1 inch. And correspondingly, about 60 to 70% of the total pollutant load that comes from an urban site occurs for rainfall events that are less than 1 inch. So we can use this concept to start to say, all right, maybe if we size these facilities to capture 1 inch of rainfall, we're getting most of it. We know we're not getting all of it. And so, we took that concept in Colorado and applied it. And really what we find is that if we were to increase the size of a stormwater quality facility by 2, we really only get a minimal additional pollutant removal, going from 88% to 90% by doubling the size. And just put this in perspective, in Denver, what we have to design these facilities for currently is about a little over 1/2 inch of rainfall. And so lastly, I'm almost done here. But these are the different types of control measures that we can use for stormwater quality. Clearly, many of these can serve for flood control and stream stability also. Detention basins, retention ponds, constructed wetlands, for example. We also are starting to move to using facilities like rain gardens, bioretention, permeable pavement, and infiltration basins. And the reason why is because these allow better infiltration and runoff reduction than some of these other control measures, which use more of a storage component. So the idea here is the water would fill up this rain garden and then slowly infiltrate back into the groundwater, thus eliminating all of that surface water from entering the streams in the first place. And so this is definitely an area that we continue to research and understand the performance of a lot better. What is really nice is that the latest MS4 permit that came out for Colorado is actually providing an incentive to use some of these more innovative approaches to infiltrate the water. So now, if we can demonstrate that we will capture runoff and fully infiltrate it, we actually have to size our facilities to only be 60% of the current water quality capture volume. So about 0.4 inches of rainfall instead of 0.6. So we have smaller facilities, they cost less, they take up less room, but they perform, just as well, if not better, than some of these other larger facilities. And in terms of the research, what I just have shown here is we are actually testing some of these in Denver to quantify whether or not we're getting the 60% infiltration. And we're doing this by doing a very controlled water truck test, where we know exactly how much water we are discharging to a bioretention cell or multiple bioretention cells. And then we can use some instruments to measure how much of that water infiltrates versus how much of it does get discharged back into the system. And you can see here, and these are a bunch of different configurations that we're kind of playing with, but we really are starting to get into that 60% range. And so we'll use that to demonstrate to CDPHE that these facilities actually do work, and we don't have to design them to be quite as big. So I took a few more minutes than was requested, but hopefully that was useful information. And if anyone has any questions, I think we'll have that session a little bit later.
Sure. Yes. Thank you, Chris, so much. So yeah, we'll go ahead and move on to our next presenter, and then we'll have question, answer, and discussion following that. So I think one thing we learned is that the solutions for stormwater are going to be quite technical. I'm sure some of you, like stormwater folks, are like, oh yeah, got this, but it's great information. Okay, so next presenter is Lee Kellenberger with the Johnson County, Kansas. And I was connected with Lee via some colleagues at Burns McDonnell, and they have a really great program for regional stormwater management. So he'll probably tell you how many cities are involved, and the county is, of course, involved. We do, Regional Planning Commission has a stormwater group. So we have a group kind of set up to do this sort of thing. But this, they do have a funding source, and he's just going to kind of tell us a little bit about their history and how they currently function and spending their money, basically. So Lee, can you hear me okay?
I can. Nicole, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear
Awesome.
you. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you guys for the opportunity to speak with you guys today. I always enjoy an opportunity to talk about stormwater management, especially on a rainy day like it is here in Kansas today. So very good presentations this morning. I really appreciate the time you guys took out to do what you're doing today. I'll try to hopefully bring it home and try to kind of look at how this all works from a program management perspective. So I'll jump right in. I know you guys have a big agenda yet today. So here's kind of what I hope to cover in my presentation. I want to focus on where the new direction we're heading, but I think to give you guys some context of where we started, it would be good. I'm going to spend a little bit of time on our history and how we got to where we're at today. So for those of you that aren't familiar with Johnson County, it's in northeast or north central Kansas. We're essentially comprised of the southwest quadrant of the Kansas City metro area. So our county is 480 square miles. We have 20 cities. Some of the larger ones you may have heard of are Overland Park, Olathe, Lenexa, Shawnee. As a stormwater manager, we tend to think of things in watersheds. We have 18 Huckate watersheds and 3 river basins. So a little bit more about Johnson County. We are a fairly affluent county. We have a lot of businesses. Our labor force is really employed in like high-tech jobs, healthcare, science, education, retail. And our population is about 620 or 600,000, just over 600,000. We have retail sales estimated over 15 billion. So, and that will come into play an important part of our program because we have a retail sales tax to fund stormwater. So, and one last slide on the background for where we come from in our area of the country. As a water resources engineer, we never always take the opportunity to talk about climate and precipitation. So here in Johnson County, we have an average annual rainfall of about 40 inches. And I looked up Benton County in your part of the world, and you guys have just over 53. So you guys already get 13 more inches of rain than we do. So you have us beat there. So on to the stormwater management program. You're going to see this timeline slide throughout my presentation. And it's a timeline that kind of highlights several key points in the evolution of our program. Starting back in 1988, when the state of Kansas passed some enabling legislation that allowed counties in Kansas to adopt a 1/10 cent sales tax for the purposes of stormwater management and flood control. So why would the state have done that? Well, actually, it was due to Johnson County. There was persistent flooding in Northeast Johnson County, and some of the mayors of those cities actually worked with their state representatives to draft the bill, and they took it to the legislature in 1988, and it got passed. it was directly tied to Johnson County, and we were the only county to adopt that tax at the time. And unfortunately, there's only 3 years to adopt the tax, and that legislation sunset after about 3 years. So the rest is kind of history. So subsequently, our Board of County Commissioners created the Stormwater Management Program, which is the county staff that we work with. We have 4.5 FTEs. And they also created we call the Stormwater Management Advisory Council. And it's a advisory board to the Board of County Commissioners. And it's comprised of one voting representative from each city. So I'd like to also point out that the passage of the sales tax was not an action, or not a vote of the people. It was just an action taken by our board. Once the tax was passed, we entered into interlocal agreements with any city who wanted to participate in the program. As you can imagine, it was pretty easy to get buy-in. We called the cities up and said, hey, we have a new funding source to address flooding problems. Do you want to participate? Needless to say, all 20 cities signed on. So we had things up and running by 1992. But before I get any farther into the implementation of the program, I just wanted to touch one more time on the funding. So I can't stress enough how funding is everything. We would not be the program we are or where we're at today if we did not have this funding source. So it's a 1/10 of a cent sales tax, where every dollar spent in Johnson County, 1/10 of a cent goes into our fund, our coffers. We're in the 30th year of our program now, and we estimate the taxes generated over $300 million. We have a cost share component to our program, so we also leverage another $100 to $200 million on top of that. So with this tax, we've been able to invest close to $500 million into stormwater management in Johnson County. So it's dedicated funding. You'll hear that mentioned several times. The Board of County Commissioners can't take it and use it for other general fund or other initiatives in the county. It's earmarked specifically for stormwater management. And finally, it's a growing source of revenue, unlike other sources of funding where you have a static amount every year, and with inflation, you lose your buying power over time. This seems to be kind of keeping up with inflation. So we could always use more, of course, but we're happy to have what we have. So, all right. So moving on back to the early 90s, we have a new program set up with a dedicated funding source. And it was weird. The county was just basically administering a program and writing checks. Cities would submit their projects if they met our project or program criteria. They administered the project, and we reimbursed them after the fact. So it remained relatively unchanged for the first 10 years. We got a lot of good flooding problems solved in our county. And we really didn't know, by the late 90s, how much longer we would have to do this. There was some discussion that maybe we don't solved all the problems, or we're getting close to solving all the problems, and talk of even sunsetting the tax. Well, keep in mind, we were working on the premise of floodplain maps that were not digital, that were from the 1970s. So similar to what sounds like in Northwest Arkansas, a whole lot of development had occurred in the last 20 years, and those static floodplain maps had not. So we really didn't know what other problems existed out there. So so we decided for the first time to take program funds and initiate a map modernization project where we work with FEMA to study all of our major watersheds in Johnson County at a very detailed level. And we mapped the existing and the future floodplains so we could use it as a planning tool to avoid creating future liabilities. So that process was started in 1998. And that allowed us to really get out ahead of some of the development and stuff. So those are still the maps that we're working off of today. So they really kind of opened our eyes, and we had a lot more flooding problems than we actually knew previous to this mapping effort. So that was a key turning point in our program. The other key event that happened right about the same time was a significant rain event on October 4th, 1998. Some of you, if you're old enough, may remember it. It was a nationally televised game, the Chiefs versus the Seahawks. And over 4 inches of rain fell in about a 2-hour period on top of already saturated soils. And it resulted in severe flooding in Johnson County. And there was 11 fatalities associated with that event. And in total, over $50 million worth of damages. So as you can imagine, a whole lot more host of significant flooding problems were identified. So with the floodplain mapping underway in the aftermath of this event, any talk of dissolving the program or sunsetting the tax quickly disappeared. So quite the opposite. We had the program was started to grow. The number of projects we were receiving was at an all-time high. And it was about this time where we decided to kind of pump the brakes and look at how we were doing business, make sure that the program was still on the right track. And so we did our first strategic plan. And at a minimum, we thought it would be a good idea to at least have a vision and a mission statement. So in 2002, it was prior to my time at the county, we completed our first strategic plan, and we had our first roadmap really for the future. So the highlights of that plan really kind of just affirmed or confirmed our direction on and focus on flood mitigation. And we did a benchmarking exercise where we brought in entities from around the country, other stormwater programs from around the country, and looked at how they were doing things. And again, we were reminded how fortunate we were to have a funding source, a dedicated funding source. What really did change, though, with our 2002 plan is that we took a more of a leadership role, and we added emphasis on not just in the past just simply a financial support mechanism, but we also started providing technical support to the cities in the form of floodplain management regulations, stream setback requirements, stormwater utility fees, help cities get stormwater utility fees implemented, and a lot of model ordinances and stuff to modernize and update how we were managing stormwater. We also started playing a more leadership role in research and development. We expanded to countywide our rain and stream gauge network. We got into use that to get into some flood forecasting and flood warning systems and so forth. And then we also started dipping our toes into water quality. We knew that we were getting MS4 permits soon. And so we took more of a leadership role in that. And the program really satisfies some of the public education and outreach and some of the public participation requirements for the cities on behalf of all the cities in Johnson County, so that each city is not doing that on their own. So the 2002 plan really served us well for the next 10 years, and we were feeling pretty good about ourselves. We hadn't been creating any new flooding problems, thankfully, thanks to the new floodplain maps we had, but we still had a long list of projects that we needed to fund to the tune of $200 million. And we were starting to hear more and more from our communities, things like, we really like to move forward with this project, but we're battling, we had an emergency repair to a large pipe that we had to fund and unexpectedly, and it ate up all of our CIP budget for the year, and so forth. So cities were getting pulled in different directions, and we also, I think, are experiencing that the climate change issues that were mentioned on some of the previous slides by the Corps of Engineers, more frequent and intense storms. So we had more and more needs and more ideas coming forward from our cities on how the program might expand. So in 2016, we initiated our second strategic planning exercise, and we didn't really know what we were going to call it at this point. We didn't even know if we were calling it a strategic plan, but we just knew that there was a gap between what the program was providing and what our communities were asking for. So we also knew that the practice of stormwater management had changed significantly over the 20 years, but the program really hadn't. We'd been focused since day one really on flooding, and specifically on capacity enhancements projects. things like channel widening and deepening and home buyouts, we really hadn't even contemplated incorporating flow attenuation or regional facilities. So, and there were some programmatic issues that we wanted to address. We felt the county should have a bigger influence on the direction of these funds. The municipal, prior to the strategic plan, this is a municipally driven approach. And sometimes that can lead to kind of a shotgun approach to stormwater management. So we also wanted to be able to forecast beyond maybe a year or so out. We wanted to look at a longer planning horizon that just programmatically we hadn't been able to do in the past. So we realized if we wanted to adapt and remain relevant to all of our stakeholders, we needed to kind of evolve. So, but I'll emphasize that, the program that we had running, we could have just continued to stick with it and continued to turn the wheel. We had a good program, but the mantra soon became, from the author Jim Collins, don't let the good be the enemy of great. We really wanted to become a better, a great program. So we kicked off or initiated the strategic plan. We used the stakeholder or steering team driven approach where we handpicked steering team members from that tried to represent our communities. We had large cities represented, small cities, ag and urban areas, elected officials and staff. We also did an in-depth stakeholder interview process with everyone that touched our program. And then we went through a kind of these standard things you would do in a strategic plan, where you did a vision and mission statement review, a benchmarking exercise, a gap analysis, and then a scenario planning and actually develop the strategic plan. So let's see here. Okay, so coming out of the first things, what we did was the stakeholder input process. We heard from our stakeholders that there was really strong support for the program, how we were administering it, and the staff overall. There was a great appreciation for the program funds and the help that we give them with their NPDS support. But there was a desire. We heard that they wanted broader project eligibility. And then we realized also that we were kind of in a unique position to consider issues on a watershed basis that cities really couldn't do. So, but there was also concerns about diluting the program if we did not come up with some additional funding sources or potentially some outside funding sources. So, second thing we did was a national benchmarking exercise where we looked at, what the state of the practice was in the nation. We reviewed similar programs. We had a couple of documents that came out about that time that were helpful and useful to kind of confirm what we were thinking. And then ultimately, the recommendations the strategic plan could have been boiled down into 5 recommendations. These kind of really align with where you guys are sitting today. I think the strategic plan really emphasized the watershed-based approach. It just makes much more sense in the municipally driven system. So I'll talk about that in a little bit. We also realized that we were not doing enough for water quality improvement. Just doing what's required of you in your MS4 permits is not going to get you achieve water quality improvement or preservation. So we also realized that we needed to take a more leadership role in the planning, and that system replacement and assessment was a critical need that our communities were facing. So the strategic plan really just gave us the direction to go. It did not get into all the details of how to put this plan into action. So all the heavy lifting and detail has come since 2016 when the board approved this. The first thing we did was look at drafting, reorganizing our organization, and then we did all of this by subcommittee approach. So we formed subcommittees around just a watershed organization, and then subcommittees around system management, water quality, flooding, and funding. And it took a lot of time. When you work on a consensus-based approach, it really can take a lot more time and seem like you're not getting far. But and ultimately, in the long run, when you can go back to your elected officials and say that we have buy-in and support from everyone in our community, and that explain to them all the thought and all the discussions that went into these recommendations, we found that we've been a lot more successful at getting things implemented. So Just a high level organizational change. Like I mentioned, we were at the water and the municipal level before. Moving forward, now we're going to be at the watershed level when we initiate projects. So rather than a city bringing a project directly to the SMP or the stormwater program, the city brings the project to their watershed organization, and the watershed organization looks at it and then brings that forward to us. So what does that look like? Here's our old organizational structure where we had all 20 cities feeding up into the stormwater program and ultimately to the Board of County Commissioners. This is the new watershed organizational framework where those same 20 cities are now lumped into these 6 watershed organizations, and they are working together to develop solutions to flooding problems. So this was a major change for our program, and one of the bigger, heavy, or the more complex and controversial moves. And so I personally went to, I think, 15 of the city council meetings and presented the approach to them and why this was the right thing to do. And ultimately, we got all 20 cities to sign on to the new approach. So today, this is how we manage our interface with our communities, is through these 6 watershed organizations. It's seems to be working fairly well so far. So the remainder of the changes out of the strategic plan really have to do with the type of projects we fund and how we fund them. So obviously moving from a local scope, the type of projects we were receiving before, we're looking at more of a local drainage issues, and cities were looking at projects within the confines of their jurisdictional boundaries, to now looking at more regional facilities, as Chris was mentioning. So, and then so on and so forth. I'm not going to go through all of these. We did change some. One of the other big changes was the percentage that we fund. So in the past, we funded 75% of capital improvement projects in the city where the project was located needed to come up with the remaining 25%. Moving forward, the standard now, the status quo is going to be 50-50 cost share funding, but we are going to make some projects eligible for 100% county funding. These are the more significant watershed projects that, if not for the program, they probably would not be able to happen. So we're still working out the details on some of this. But to kind of conclude here, in the past, we were just focused on flooding. That still will be a main focus of our program, but we're looking at shifting towards more of a public safety versus a property damage approach. So looking at roadway flooding is more prioritized in the new system. And we're also looking, and to complement that, we're looking at standing up a voluntary or opportunistic home buyout program to look at addressing some of those issues where property damage is more of a concern. So I think those 2 programs will complement themselves well. We're also going to be starting to fund water quality improvement and preservation projects right alongside flooding. Our scoring system we're in the works right now, is that a city A can have a flooding project and receive a score in our system for that. City B is more focused on water quality. They can submit a project on water quality, and the 2 can be compared on the same level playing field. So we have pots of money now for water quality, system management, and flooding. So these can be things like retrofitting existing infrastructure or creating entirely new water quality features like wetlands or even stream banks restoration projects. So that was a big need from some of our cities. So, and then system management, which I touched on as well. This photo was taken in Northeast Johnson County after a heavy rain. The semi truck driver thought he was safe to park his truck in a Hobby Lobby parking lot. He came out the next day to find his semi tractor trailer had collapsed into and had parked right on top of a failing corrugated metal pipe. And so that was an interesting recovery of it. So more and more of these instances are occurring. So we've set up a program to help cities assess their stormwater infrastructure and help them fund it with a 50-50 cost share. So we have a scoring system set up based on the likelihood of failure and the consequence of failure. So the county is really only getting involved in those projects where there's an extremely high likelihood and an extremely high consequence if that asset were to fail. So the vast majority of the system is still ultimately the city's responsibilities and would not qualify for our funding. So, and then finally, the fourth component of our program with the new watershed-based approach is planning. Since it's probably beyond the scope of any one city to look at, comprehensively look at the stormwater issues in an entire watershed, because watersheds cross many municipal boundaries, the county program is taking on that role of doing planning at the watershed scale. So this is really important because the flooding problem may be downstream in city A, but the best solution for that flooding problem may not be in that city. It may actually be upstream in city B. So hence the need for watershed master planning. We recently initiated, or we're in the final stages of developing watershed master plans for all 6 of our organizations. And those are going to be looking at the existing risks and opportunities related to flooding, water quality, and system management. We're also looking at hydromodification and geomorphology. With the stream bank erosion issues, we have those same issues as well, in addition to flooding. So we've worked with our teams to look at what is the active river corridor and what is an appropriate buffer width on that. So similar to how we have floodplain boundaries today, we are mapping now in our county erosion hazard boundaries. So it's just another good planning tool for communities so that they don't put infrastructure or build buildings within the active river corridor or the erosion hazard zone. So that's going to be a new tool moving forward that's come out of our plans. So, and then just some of the other outcomes of our strategic plan and our master plans, it's just generated more conversation around stormwater issues. And I think that's been a good thing, more education to our elected officials. We think we have a more efficient program to benefit more county stakeholders today. And then we've been able to develop some really cool and new practical tools to kind of help drive our program goals. So I know that was a lot to cover, 30 years of our program in less than 30 minutes, but just to leave you with some key lessons learned, and I can't stress enough the funding issue is how fortunate we are to have a dedicated funding source. And if there's any opportunity or any consideration of that, I would highly encourage you to come up with a funding source. We saw a lot of different programs around the country that collaborate some on some water quality things or might do a project here or there, but very few that had a dedicated funding source to do real long-term meaningful work and like it sounds like what you guys are trying to do. So the other lesson learned is to involve all the stakeholders, and even though it takes more time and it's sometimes difficult, you'll have a better product at the end if you obtain consensus along the way, and you can go to your elected officials with full support and buy-in. So, and change is hard. We don't like change. We like to kind of continue to crank the wheel or do easy things sometimes, but in the end, it was very worthwhile. I think our last strategic planning exercise was very good exercise for us to go through. So, and that is the end of my discussion, Nicole. So I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you so much, Lee. That was great. Okay, does anyone have any questions for Rhiannon, Lee, or Chris? Okay, but keep in mind, you need a microphone for Chris and Lee to hear you.
First off, I just want to say thank you to the Illinois River Watershed Partnership and the program that you're putting on today. I think this is very relevant to today's topics and subjects. So first off, commend that. I also commend everybody taking time out of their day, to come here and try to do this open discussion, which is wonderful. As I said in my interview, my name is Bob Schaffner. I have a farm in Centerton. I also am on our Benton County Farm Bureau Board in our Arkansas State Environmental Committee. And the impact in Northwest Arkansas is huge. And this is a huge issue. My question, and I don't know if that's either to Chris or to Lee or to someone else in the room that's a lot smarter than me, is the discharge rate and volume coming out of a retention pond. What is that? What is there something that farmers like myself can have an opportunity to look at to understand what's going on? I have an opportunity at my place with a subdivision right to the west of me, and I've been fighting this for a long time and would just like to have some information on that, and also just appreciate the dialogue that we're trying to do here. Most of the municipalities, as you all well know, we are growing, but it relies on farmers and landowners that sells these farms to put these subdivisions in so y'all can get your tax base. But at the same time, if it's still a productive farm, it's impacting me to produce food, fiber, and fuel to provide for y'all. Because I don't think at the end of the day, you want to eat your iPhone, because that's not going to be very tasty or very good. So we need to work together as farmers and also as landowners. And, through this process, my farm was going to be one of the backups to either the Crawfords or the Simpsons or Dan Henderson's place today. But I was down in Kingston at my other place, baling hay, and there's no internet down there for the last couple of weeks. So I'm not on that. But I welcome anybody that wants to talk to me after we go through the tour this afternoon. But my question still is on these detention ponds, either that, you were talking about on-site or regional, what is that discharge and flow? Because that's my biggest issue that I have on my place is we've got a retention pond on the subdivision, but there is no detention or retention at all. Matter of fact, it concentrates and funnels it and pushes it out even at a higher rate. As you've seen, when water goes through a funnel, it comes out at the end at a very high rate, and it is washing me away. I've had the USGS out there years ago, did a dye study. We have a lot of karsts, a lot of disappearing streams, and just worry about the water quality. They talk about sucky days and all this other stuff, turbidity, as it was mentioned earlier, when we're dumping all this phosphorus into the water. This is part of the process, and it starts at this local level where you have a subdivision upstream of a producing farm.
And I'll say for Mr. Schaffner, he has no mapped creek, river, or stream on his property. So it's not just the creek is flooding, it's that water is running over his property. I don't know if anyone wants to answer the question. It varies by city, right? Is that correct?
It's going to vary depending on the particular subdivision, whether it's in the county or if it's in a city or if it's just in a city's planning jurisdiction. So you're going to get some variance throughout Northwest Arkansas just based off of whose planning organization that particular subdivision went through. You'd have to pull the drainage report on that to confirm it all.
So that shows you need to have more regional planning or have a bigger, broader plan. Because if it's spotty like that, if I understood correctly, that between on-site and regional, in Chris's presentation, it shows that importance of trying to figure out it all versus just, well, I'm in the city of, or I'm in one city versus I'm in the county area. So that obviously this is a very important work that we're doing here today and we're talking about today.
Bob Schofter's place, that's one of the subdivisions that went in around 2004. And what we learned from that is that those outfall structures are just right along the property line and the impact on the adjacent property. So what we've done since then is look at having that spreader so that because of that concentrated flow, it's not coming soon enough. We thought it would be done, but that pond is supposed to be reworked. In the meantime, I think since it's taking a little while, maybe there's something we can do to see about reducing that impact on your property. There is a redesign on the pond that is supposed to help that. So, but it's been a while. It's been a couple of years. So, but.
And ma'am, you're with City of Centerton, correct? Yeah. Please do an introduction beforehand. There you go.
Hi, thanks. James Simpson. This question would be for Lee. Having the watershed-based approach to the stormwater makes a lot of sense. And I think what we're seeing in Northwest Arkansas is that the stormwater rules you have to meet are different from city to city. So what one city does or doesn't do negatively impacts the downstream city. But my question for Lee is, how does that watershed-based approach affect or interact with the MS4 permitting, which is municipality-based?
Great question. So currently, we still have an MS4 city by city jurisdiction. So, however, we have been successful in getting KDHE, the Kansas Department of Health and Environment, to allow us to modify how we do our TMDL monitoring. So we now are doing that on a watershed-based approach. And then how we ultimately, I think that KDHE, and we didn't do it for this version, we just got our new 5-year permits, but I don't see that it's out of the realm of the possibility that we could ultimately end up with watershed-based MS4 permits here in Kansas, maybe as a test in Johnson County in the next revision of permits, because it makes so much more sense to do our MS4 permitting on a watershed basis. There might be still specific elements like erosion and sediment control enforcement and post-construction enforcement that are delegated to the cities, but some of the other, we hope that the watershed organizations that we have created, that maybe gives them an additional purpose for meeting and informing, and that they work together on the RMS4 permits as well. But yes, as today, it's still a municipally based system in Kansas, but I'm hopeful that in the next version of permits, we can move even farther to the watershed-based permitting.
Hi, my name is Donna. I'm also with Centerton. I was wondering if you could elaborate on the full spectrum detention that was briefly touched on earlier.
Chris?
Yeah. Again, the idea there is really to control all events from small to large. And so I didn't get into it too much, but there's a calculation involved with that we call the excess urban runoff volume, the EURV. And that's essentially what it sounds like is when we develop a watershed, how much additional runoff volume is generated. And, that gets into that, changing from 10% of runoff to 40% of runoff or even greater. And then that all has to be captured and stored in a detention facility and then released over approximately 2 to 3 days. We do have a requirement due to water rights that we have to discharge all of the ponds within 97 hours. But generally they're designed to completely empty within about 3 days.
Chris, is there a summary or a document that we could share with the cities to give a little bit more detail on it?
Yeah, absolutely. I can work with you on that, Nicole. Otherwise, if people just want to do some internet sleuthing, they can Google full spectrum detention or even go to the Mile High Flood District's website, and there are multiple papers around that concept on the website.
Great.
But certainly
Yeah.
I could help provide those too.
Yeah. If you wouldn't mind sending me something, I can send it out to the group.
Okay, sure.
Okay, so I am going to move on to my ask, and then we can continue on with questions and discussion for as long as the group would like. But I want to walk away from this event with kind of thoughts on how we could coordinate better and then what individual communities could do. And so this is, I think, the culmination of my career at IRWP. This request. Okay, here's my request. You guys ready for this? By the end of 2022, Transform Regional Planning Commission's Stormwater Compliance Group to a Regional Stormwater Management Advisory Council. Okay. For smaller cities, Lee talked about providing technical assistance, their stormwater group providing technical assistance. So for our smaller cities, leverage advisory council and regional planning expertise to create a proactive plan for stormwater management, not just stormwater compliance. Review and assess existing stormwater infrastructure to make sure it's working properly. Review drainage manual and ordinances to ensure that adoption of infiltration or LID practices, that they're just not, abjectly not allowed. EPA came out with this great report in late 2020, I believe, evaluating stormwater infrastructure funding and financing, which talks about a wide variety of ways that you can fund stormwater and conservation as well. Reforest city-owned riparian areas and educate residents about the reasons for doing so. This is a pretty cheap option. By the end of 2024, fix those structural problems that were identified. Provide technical assistance to your POAs or property owners that own those stormwater assets. This is a big one. Hire a consultant to conduct region-wide assessment of stormwater management options in current and projected future urban areas, which I don't know if we have a projected future expansion. Do you know, Elizabeth, to put you on the spot? Oh, okay. And IRWP would be willing to help raise funds to get this region-wide assessment. We are willing to do this at no cost to the cities or counties if we can manage it. By the end of 2026, implement agreed upon region-wide option to implement comprehensive stormwater management or low impact development practices. Adopt Regional Planning Commission's open space plan into your urban planning and stormwater management policies and processes. Make a plan to conserve high priority properties as identified by that map. If you're not familiar with that map, you can speak with the lovely Elizabeth Bowen with Regional Planning Commission, that she's a project manager on that. So whenever we started planning this event, I said, I'm less worried about raising the funds and more worried about getting political buy-in. Nobody's laughing at my joke. Okay, any thoughts, questions, angry? Oh no, John's gonna, okay, Morgan, right behind you.
I had a question for you and Lee, really, and you segued to it. I'm curious if they are using any of their dedicated funding to preserve open space, because that was something that I was thinking through as you were going through the presentation.
Lee, it's for you.
Great question. So we are dipping our toe in that water as well. So the master plans I mentioned, one of the things we worked with was through the conservation fund, and we had them do an analysis of high priority conservation areas as well. So we have maps in our county with parcels highlighted in green, and those are our high priority conservation areas. We don't know with our dedicated funding source yet whether or not, we have not approached our commission to say, here's what we want to do. We want to purchase this and preserve it. We feel like we need to come up with tell the story of what the ecosystem services are, what that property is providing, what it could be, and why it's important in our system. So we still, that the studies in that area and the ecosystem services values is we're still not enough well versed in that, and it's relatively new to us. So we just have maps at this point. So I think the goal is in the future is to start doing that as well. But as you guys know, things are growing fast here as well. So 10 years, a lot of those parcels could be developed. So time is of the essence as well for us, but we have not done that yet.
And I think when Lee and I were visiting, one thing that kind of came to light to me is, every neighborhood's not going to have open space. Every road's not going to have a bioswale. Like they kind of do what's politically feasible for their county.
One thing we have a great park system in Johnson County. We have a county parks board, and they have a great acquisition program where they've have a large dedicated funding source to go out and buy up parkland. And so a lot of our future projects, I think, will be on that undeveloped parkland. So we have some preservation through our parks department already, but we could be doing more.
Ooh, County Parks Department. Any other thoughts? Yes, sir.
Yes, Aaron Bimler, Burns McDonald. Lee, this is for you to continue the funding discussion. On your watershed organizations, are a certain percentage going to each watershed? Or are you trying to allocate those funds accordingly per population or per, to preserve those funds on an annual basis? And then my second question to go with that, are cities in those watershed organizations, how are they coming up with that 50-50 match? Is it stormwater development fees, or is it, what creative ways are you seeing?
Yeah. Right now, to your first question, no, we do not have, each watershed organization does not get a pot of money from us. We still have a risk-based system. So our county funds are going to flow to the highest risk areas in the watershed. So no, but we do have separate pots of money for system management versus flooding and water quality. So that, and then we can roll our money. We don't have to use it all in 1 year. So if there isn't enough projects to spend down all the money for water quality, for example, we can roll that into a future year's program and save up for larger projects that way. So, and then towards the cost share, or where the cities are getting their cost share, there's a various different mechanisms that the cities have used. Stormwater utility fees are probably the most popular. Some cities use benefit districts, and if it's a neighborhood project, they do the assessment on the properties that are benefiting from that project. But the vast majority of them are using stormwater utility fees. Some cities use general fund dollars, but stormwater utility fees are great. We actually did a study once to looking at collecting, in addition to the sales tax, what if we did this countywide stormwater utility fee for all communities, but that each city wanted to do their own. So that's where we're at now.
So at this point, the part of our ask is not a stormwater utility fee. As we said, you got to find what's right for your community. But we did talk about perhaps a region-wide assessment. And can I put Ryan Benefield on?
Sure. Thanks, Nicole. And you and I have talked about this a lot. So I'm going to save you all some time on number 4 up there, read EPA's report, because the conclusion of that is to call the Natural Resources Division. We manage all of EPA's funds related to water quality and even stormwater in the state that we can give out in grants and loans. So we're fully willing to, we have available funds to do most of those things right now. Now, not to the level that he's talking about with the dedicated funding source and 6 or 8 million a year over 40 years. But yeah, we're definitely willing to step in and help fund any kind of study that needs to be done, or even projects. I mean, we have, most of you have heard from me recently on even a new stormwater initiative we have going out to MS4 specifically to do stormwater projects too. We've talked to the Corps. They're willing to cost share with us on some future studies. So really what we're looking for, because the funding to do some preliminary work is definitely there, but what Nicole said earlier about the funding's there, but the consensus is really what we would need, is to make sure everyone was on the same page about how we went forward with any kind of study. But any city wanting to do work on stormwater, it qualifies for about 6 of our different funding programs right now.
Woot woot. Okay, that's great news. Yes.
One thing, observation I've made, and being a farmer, I get out in the morning early and stuff, and during some of these significant rainfall events, I've gone out and looked at some of our detention ponds, and Chris, you talked so much about the detention ponds and collecting and releasing water at the natural rate, but pre-development. 9 out of 10 of our detention ponds out there don't detain a damn thing. They just act as a funnel and funnel it right through because the outflow or the weir or the exit is too big. They don't retain any water, even during significant events. Ron, would there be funds available for special projects if some of these detention ponds were identified to come in and redesign the weir? Would there be money involved for that? And who is responsible for looking at this? Most of these ponds are developed by private developers. I'm going to throw rocks here, okay? I'm going to throw them straight up in there wherever they want to land. I'm not aiming them at anybody in particular. Is it the engineers that design the detention ponds in the development? Is it the cities that aren't looking at the designs properly? Is it DEQ not saying, hey, we need more guidance here? God forbid we don't want to get the legislature involved. I've been there. No, we don't want to do that. But do we need to look at these things? Who is responsible and where will the funds come from to try to make the infrastructure we currently have function properly? That's a lot of talking, but you get the gist of it.
No, and so where we're at with Natural Resource Division of the Department of Ag is where we can help you do both sides of it, planning on the front end or, you know, improving it on the back end. The part we're not in is the middle part, which is the development side or the actual construction of the detention basin. But, you know, what we're looking at is trying to, you know, if we have an issue, whether it's, you know, how it was developed or even the precipitation issue. And Rand and I were talking about earlier, regardless of whether it's more precipitation or whether it was lack of design, it's a problem now to be fixed, right? I mean, so either way, we can come in and either on the front end help fund planning activities on how you might want to do work, or the back end fund work to maybe even correct the situation that exists in the watershed.
Can
I'll put one more suggestion out too, is there's what's called adaptive controls. You guys have mentioned retrofitting existing facilities that are underperforming right now. There's advanced like adaptive controls you can place on detention basin outlet structures and retrofit some of these facilities. Maybe you guys have done it in their areas where they can, they're smart facilities where they, if rain is forecasted in the near future, it can draw down detention basins, or it can monitor the level in the basins and meter that flow out at an appropriate level or at a lower velocity or for different goals that you may have. So there's adaptive control technology out there these days, if you are not aware.
And again, we're all doing the best we can here in Northwest Arkansas. Mayor Sprouse, so good to see you.
Sorry I'm late, and I hope I don't bring up something that has already been discussed, but while we're talking about funding, how much do we know? I know Springdale is like every other city in every county trying to digest this American Rescue Plan and ways that we can utilize some of that funding. And we're looking for ways to utilize it on projects that will last, that will, and certainly this, you know, stormwater issues that we're trying to address would qualify for our goals. I don't know if there's how much work has been done and how much maybe RWP or other groups have actually concluded what can and cannot be spent, what type of projects would be eligible based on the Treasury guidance we've gotten so far. You know, if we as a city, if we have a project identified and brought to us that is eligible for that we're convinced and confident is eligible for rescue plan funding, then we would certainly look at that very favorably and try and get that done. So I don't know how much work, I don't know if we're far enough along yet with digesting that guidance. And we all know the guidance can also change and be adjusted. So where are we at on that? If anyone can address it.
We have the right
I'll just
stakeholders in the room.
tell you, the one thing that we do know is that if it qualifies for clean water state revolving fund dollars, it's supposed to qualify for American Rescue Plan dollars. So we manage the clean water SRF. So if it does, and typically stormwater projects related to MS4s or other things do qualify. Here you go, boss.
Well, thanks, Ryan. Wes Ward from the Arkansas Department of Agriculture, and I can speak generally because the mayor's right. There's a lot of questions, and the guidance may change. Where we are at this point, certainly it's a high priority for the governor. He's asked us for a plan, and so we're working on putting together some sort of planning document of what that may look like. Certainly, the legislature will be very involved in that as far as the overall. The $1.57 billion is going to the state. So we're working on that piece. There's been some discussions of, is there potential to use some of the state funding and try to get some sort of match from the counties or the cities to make that go further, to get better buy-in and accomplish more. So very generally, we're working on it. We're moving as fast as we can. Arkansas does have a steering committee that was set up by the governor to help recommend and approve how that $1.57 billion would be used, but then ultimately it will go to the legislature for their review and approval of those plans and expenditures. So more to come.
And if we should ever get an infrastructure bill passed, we'll be well positioned.
My question comes back to the discharge at these locations. So what is the best case scenario that you found so far with your research on how to control that discharge point? So no matter if you have a retention pond, you redesign your detention pond, at some point that volume will have to discharge. And where we see in the built environment is whether you have an outfall, check dams, weir wall, or an apron and then a runnel to another retention pond. Is it a series? It is a recreated wetland. How can you mitigate for that to decrease that volume? Because it'll be a point source from there, like where you can decrease the speed and then let it either infiltrate or then hold it again. I don't know how you could do that without, requiring too much land use or what is the best case scenario for that? Besides the natural environment, of course.
Chris, I think that's you.
Yeah, sorry. I don't have a great answer or solution for that. I mean, typically you're outfalling to whatever's available, whether that's a minor drainage way into the underground system, whatever presents itself. I mean, if you're having issues with the discharge from these facilities, I'm assuming maybe there's some erosion and things like that, then that just needs to really be handled, on an individual basis. I really don't think that there's a good sort of overall solution for what I'm understanding the issue is.
It depends.
Yeah.
The best answer in science.
Hi, I'm Brenda Mackey. I'm an engineer, but just to add on to Chris, I think what you were saying, I mean, what we're observing or what I'm observing is that, I mean, it's a challenge. We really do have to look at it watershed wide. When we look up in the watershed, that's our opportunity to really collect the water, right? So what can we do there. That's going to be our most economical place to start looking for solutions. So where can we infiltrate more? What are some options even to reduce impervious areas or use those differently and more efficiently? Because once it gets in that system and starts moving downstream, that's where it's going to get really challenging. But I will say that I think it's an opportunity for this group to really use that data that we have now that we didn't have 10 years, 20 years ago, when a lot of our criteria was originally developed for stormwater. So we really do have an opportunity to start to look at retrofitting our systems to use them even better. And like Lee mentioned, some of the more adaptive kind of real-time controls are really interesting and could really work as more of a watershed approach to help us think about that infrastructure for the next generation.
Thank
My
you.
2 cents.
Yeah,
there.
and Brenda works in Kansas City, correct? So you're intimately familiar with Johnson County systems. Any other questions, thoughts? Okay. So we do have a field tour scheduled. We will be going to the Crawford's property right here. Raise your hand. They're right across, right around the corner from us. We do have some buses that will hold 42 people, and then we'll do personal cars after that. But the Crawfords are on a quite volatile piece of Osage Creek, right over the bridge. You've probably driven over it 100 times. And then we have the Simpsons, James and Linda Simpson here, who, yeah, you'll see. And then we have Mr. Dan Douglas. We're going to take a look at some stormwater erosion on his property. Cliff, can I put you on the spot for a second? I should warn people before I'm going to do this, but you are a passionate landowner on Osage Creek in the Illinois, and you're kind of seeing the stuff, and you've seen the stuff for a while. And I was hoping maybe you could just kind of give your perspective before we head out and load up on buses.
Yeah, thanks for the no notice, but she knows that, there's no such thing as a short speech for me, but actually our property is at the very end of Osage Creek. So where we have the confluence of the Illinois and Osage is where we live and have for 40 something years. So we have a lot of, probably 1.5 miles or 2 miles of river frontage. And we've talked about these events. April of 2000, I've been out there 43 years. Was an old bridge on Highway 68 that many people travel for years. In April of 17, the water went over the top of that bridge that was built in 1934 and never been over before. So, I mean, we're seeing these increasing massive amounts of water coming through there. We've heard it detailed today, but I'm not an engineer and I'm not a scientist, but maybe I remember things real well. But that area out there is it's really being decimated, and on upstream, landowners are seeing just vast amounts of their riverbanks gone, and it's relatively in a short period of time, basically 10 years. But talking about the retention ponds, several people have brought it up. And I think somebody that's an engineer said this, and I won't quote who it was, but they're very knowledgeable engineer said, the retention ponds were put in and they individually are serving the purpose that they were built for. But no one's measuring the cumulative effect of hundreds of retention ponds. And so when we get, like the other day, we had an event that Ed called me about and said, is the water flow really what I'm seeing at Elm Springs? What was the flow, Ed? How much?
Yeah, 50,000. Well, we had a rain event that we were just talking about in April that we were getting 4 inches an hour. So we had an 8-inch rain in a relatively short period of time, and it was just unreal what happened there. But I don't know, Nicole, what else, I could say, but it's it really is a regional, absolutely. We have to approach it from a regional concept. And the state of Arkansas, the state of Oklahoma, you get over into Delaware and Cherokee County and go down the river. And I've got several friends that are property owners, farmers and ranchers down there. And I mean, what's even happened in the last 5 years is pretty spectacular on further downriver. Ed made a great point one time in one of our board meetings. He said, typically economic development occurs downstream towards the confluence of rivers. All the economic development in this watershed go up to Pinnacle. That's what hits close to me. That's Osage Creek. That's where it starts. South of Fayetteville in the national forest is where the Illinois River starts. So it's all up in here, and it's picking up speed every mile that it goes. So if we can approach this regionally, everybody's doing the best they can. That's what we want to make sure that we're clear on. The RWP, whatever we can do as an organization to bring the region together, I think that'd be a successful approach for us. So now, I didn't start yelling, did I? Because I can get into discussing this. I've become a stormwater. We have other places that we run cattle on around, primarily Benton County, but even Judy over in Siloam Springs, I've got a beautiful place I lease on the city limits up by Dawn Hill. And there's a lot of development in that area in Siloam Springs. And what we're seeing off of that development, even with those there retention ponds, and like once again, it was engineered properly and it's doing what it's supposed to, but it's not working. That's what I would say. And it's not working in a lot of places. Doing what it's supposed to do, it's just not working. So.
Thank you, Cliff. RWP's board president, and I would guarantee you there are hundreds of Cliffs out there. All right, Miss Elizabeth.
So I just wanted to kind of share with you, there's several items here that Nicole has put on this list that has to do with my organization. So I'm with the Northwest Arkansas Regional Planning Commission. So we keep talking about regionalism. That's definitely a key. I think we need to be thinking bigger than the Illinois River watershed. We have a lot more problems with water, stormwater outside of Illinois. Beaver Water. There's 7 just in our 2 counties that I, primarily do the work for. We are a consortium of governments. So Mayor Sprouse, Mayor Edwards, and the 31 other, I'll say 29 other, 31 total mayors are my membership. That's who I work for, the 2 county judges, one represented here today. So, and additionally, besides being a regional planning commission, we are also the Metropolitan Planning Organization. So Benton, Washington County, and also a portion of McDonald County, Missouri. So we serve that membership. So if the membership wants to do these items, the Northwest Arkansas Open Space Plan that Nicole mentioned that I'm the project manager for, the stormwater, Celia Scott Silkwood, who today is her last day. So Nicole Gibbs from Centerton, we stole her from Centerton. She will be, I know. But think about, she's going to be able to help all of us now, not just you. So we have a lot of things that the Regional Planning Commission and the MPO are able to do, but it's based on what our membership wants. So if the stormwater compliance group needs to be moved up a level, right now that organization provides the education and outreach based on that stormwater permit, the MS4 permits. We're able to do that. It's like I say, it's based on funding, need, and the request from our membership. I think in these conversations, it was also mentioned, this study that is wanting to happen. If our membership requested that our organization, provide the guidance and the support for that, we have the capability of doing that. And we've done it many times, like the open space plan, transit. We do it for lots of different things for the region. So we're here, we're available. We do what our membership requests. We have lots of capability within our office. So regionalism is definitely the key here. But I would suggest that we think even bigger. It's not just Illinois River. We have a much bigger problem and picture that we can work on.
Okay, so I think next step, and I'll just, for the members of the Stormwater group that are here, I don't know if we can do this, Elizabeth, but like, next step is to continue the conversation via the Stormwater group.
There's 21 MS4 permits. So the cities and I think the University of Arkansas and the 2 counties are those 21 entities. At your next meeting, you have those monthly at our organization. That's definitely an item that can be discussed. Those organizations need to be talking to their mayors and make sure that that's what those organizations want to do.
And IRWP can continue the conversation with Natural Resources Division. Okay. Any other questions, comments? I hope you will join us. Oh, yes, Representative Garner.
I just have one thing, and that is to think even bigger, statewide. What can we do at the state to help education-wise as much as anything? Wes, we can certainly get together and talk about some of those kinds of things, but tax and rev, we can talk about some of the tax issues, but what can we do to help? Because that's where we get the information to start any policy change is from you guys. So please keep us all in mind, Megan, Godfrey, and David, and there are others as well that just couldn't be here today. So please keep us in mind and let us know what we can do from the state level as well.
That's great. Anyone want to draft up a bill? Right. I have to start with a different area of the state. No, I'm just, oh, yes. Oh, yeah.
I'm sorry. I just wanted to make a comment. I don't want to draft a bill, so I'm good with that. But as energy and environment, which includes the DEQ division, I know some of you work with us on regulatory matters, but the broader department is interested in working. We are been engaged since the start of the Hutchinson administration in working with Oklahoma, and I really appreciate seeing some of you here. These folks have really been willing to sit down and problem solve and come up with watershed improvement strategies, but they won't work if we don't have the buy-in and the commitments, and it fits what the cities want and the county needs up here. So our efforts with my counterpart, Ken Wagner in Oklahoma, and the governors have all been about allowing the advancement of agriculture in our states, allowing the advancement of economic development and community support, recognizing that all has to be done in a way that's going to bolster the water quality of the Illinois watershed. So, and to help not only Arkansans in protecting the water, but also Oklahomans. And so I just wanted to further our commitment to that. We're going to be having some continuing discussion. We have an agreement in place. It was converted from a 10-year or short-term agreement to a long-term sustainable agreement that keeps the states at the table all the time. So it's really not our agreement, it's your agreement. And I hope that you will work with us. And I know some of the difficulties as we go through some of the regulatory decisions, those won't be easy, but I think it's important that we continue to have permits that allow our cities to expand, but also protect. And I think we're on that track right now to see that happen in Northwest Arkansas after being kind of at a standstill for maybe over 20 years. So I'm looking forward to those discussions with Oklahoma and even the EPA, maybe not that part, but we'll work through that. And But overall, any feedback you have to me, I appreciate it. And any feedback you have to our, we have Alan York here now as our Office of Water Quality Director. He's committed to working with y'all any way we can serve this community and help Northwest Arkansas be what it wants to be and what it can be. It's about potential. I think, as the speakers on the phone said, it's looking to the future, not just looking at the past. So thanks.
Thank you, Secretary Keown. Thank you for being here.